Alright, so tonight we're going to be talking about evolution. It's a huge topic in college. It could be 1 or 2 semesters just to talk about evolution. Some people, it's all they study their whole life. So it's huge. We're covering it in a week. Obviously, this is going to be a little bit superficial, but we will cover some of the major points. So it's really important that you stay focused and ask any questions that you come up with along the way because there are a lot of components and a lot of sort of misconceptions out there in the world. All right, so evolution. Accepted definition today is the process by which species change, and specifically any change in the frequency of an allele in a population's gene pool. So this is really important, and we're going to talk about what a gene pool is. So a gene pool is all the alleles that exist in a population. So if you think about dogs, we know that they all evolved from wolves. And so all the genes that make up dogs will probably exist in wolves in different combinations. And if you look at different dogs, say a Chihuahua and a Great Dane, you know that clearly they have different alleles, just like I have different alleles than someone who has brown eyes because I only have blue eye alleles, and someone who has brown eyes has a brown eye allele. But these are all alleles that are present in the population. So that's how we get so many different dogs, but they are all the same species. And that's how we get so many different people that look very different, but we're all the same species. Essentially the definition of a species is that you can breed. So, yeah, and produce viable offspring. Okay. So evolution, again, is a property of a population, not an individual. So you can't evolve on your own. It's kind of a false notion. Evolution occurs on the scale of a population, not the individual. All right, so who first started talking about evolution? Obviously, the ancient Greeks. They were ahead of the curve on everything. They came up with basically all of geometry. They also thought about lots of things in science. So Aristotle had some thoughts about this, but it wasn't really until the 1800s that things really got going. So early 1800s, we had Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he proposed that the organisms seen in the fossil record evolved into modern organisms by acquiring traits. And this seems pretty logical. So if you look at the fossil record, you see like a dinosaur, and then you look today and you see a chicken. Obviously, something happened in the middle there. So his specific view starts with organisms responding to a need and using a specific body part. So if we look at our giraffe example, the giraffes respond to the need of eating off this high tree by stretching their necks. And then their stretched necks are passed on to their offspring. And then their offspring also want to eat, maybe the higher parts of this tree. And so they stretch their necks some more, and they pass it on again to their offspring. And so the corollary to that is that unused parts or traits disappear. So that's why we don't see any short-necked giraffes, because they're just not using a short neck. So this is Lamarck's proposal for a mechanism. Fortunately, this is not quite how it works. So as we know from just say looking at Arnold Schwarzenegger, he acquired really big muscles, but these did not get passed on to his son. He has sort of normal musculature going on here. So it's not about stretching your neck or building your muscles. That's not quite how traits are passed on. So we want to think about how can traits be passed on. Usually it starts with an acquired mutation. So you want to think back to the last unit. When were mutations talked about? All right, so I'll give you a second to think about that. Okay. So a mutation in a reproductive cell, remember those are the cells that make your gametes, your sperm and your eggs, may or may not have an effect on an organism. So perhaps one of my Ugonia has a mutation. It might not affect me in my daily life, but it could be passed on to my children. So a mutation in a reproductive cell can be passed on to future generations. And this is sort of the origin of all, we talked about mutations, being the origin of all variation in a population. Okay. So this brings us to Darwin. Darwin, you've heard of him. He traveled the world in this ship called the HMS Beagle between 1831 and 1836. He observed many, many animals and plants and all sorts of things all over the world. And he started thinking about this during his journey, and then after. So one specific thing that we always talk about is the Galapagos. He visited the Galapagos. If you look here, they're right off the coast of South America. By right off the coast, we mean about 700 miles. So we want to think about why it might be important. I'll give you a second to write down that the Galapagos are really far away from the mainland of South America. What might that have to do with what species would be able to get there, or the amounts of species or variations of species you'd find, the diversity of species in the Galapagos? And this is also true for any islands. We just focus on the Galapagos in specific because there's been a lot of research there, partially because Darwin sort of originally went there and had a lot of ideas. Okay, give you a second to write. Okay, so on the islands of the Galapagos, Darwin observed lots of things: giant tortoises, finches, iguanas, all sorts of things. In particular, he looked at the different finches, and he noticed that there were different finches on almost every island. This is a pretty small group of islands. They're very close together, and probably have somewhat similar environments, but not quite. So, because this is a volcano chain, so some of these have older volcanoes, some of them are still active. There's different things going on. And what he noticed is that all these finches had different beak sizes. And since the Galapagos are so far away, he thought they probably all came from one finch. So now we know that they all come from this one ancestor finch in South America, and then evolved through a term called adaptive radiation into different finches. Alright. So from this, Darwin created his theory of natural selection, which has a few main points we're going to go through. It's all based on his observations, and he published it in 1859. So one of the fundamental tenets of it is that all species have a really high reproductive rate. So think about bunny rabbits. Yet the population numbers remain fairly constant. So the planet is not covered with rabbits, because there are pressures on rabbits that mean that they are not just taking over the planet. And what we found is that only the most fit, so rabbits that are not eaten by wolves, or rabbits that can reproduce, are the only ones that we see today. So natural selection is constantly working to select only the best animals. And best is not as subjective as it seems. It's which organisms can live long enough to reproduce and then produce offspring that then will go on to reproduce. It's about passing on those genes. Okay. So natural selection is possible because, again, we have this inherent variation of traits within a species. So this goes back to the gene pool. Dachshunds and huskies are part of the same species. There's clearly inherent variation there. And these variations can arise from mutation and recombination through sexual reproduction. So hopefully you remember some things about sexual reproduction in terms of the different factors that happen. Hopefully crossing over and independent assortment come to mind. So traits that increase the survival and reproduction allow individuals to produce more offspring. So if you think back to our giraffes, the giraffes that happen to have longer necks are probably going to produce more offspring. Traits that are neutral or harmful reduce or eliminate the number of offspring produced by individuals with them. So I'm going to show you the giraffes again. So these are the same giraffes, but they're Darwin's mechanism versus Lamarck's. So we take it, our first point is that there's tall and short giraffes in a population, result of mutation. So maybe they all started off short, and then a couple ones had some mutations, and that's why they're taller. So then natural selection happens. And natural selection is a constant process. It's not just like, well, there's giraffes, and then there's natural selection, and then there's something else. It's not quite like that. It's a constant thing. So the short giraffes, they have a little bit of trouble reaching the food. They probably won't be as fit, so maybe they can't find mates as easily. They're less appealing looking, all skinny and whatnot. And maybe they can't run as fast away from predators. A lot of things could be a problem if you can't get to food as easily. So they don't reproduce as much, but they do reproduce a little bit. Got two giraffes here, and then the second generation, we only have one short giraffe here. Um, the tall ones, they're more fit, they have more access to food, and so they're going to reproduce more. So you start off with the tall giraffes, you have more tall giraffes in the second generation, and eventually, as tall giraffes are more successful and short giraffes are less successful, tall giraffes come to dominate the population. All right. So evolution today, Darwin's views are generally accepted by the scientific community today, and we'll learn about the different modifications and variations that build upon Darwin's fundamental ideas that he built. But we have not changed the basic principles of natural selection that Darwin laid out. Okay, so I want everyone to write down any questions you have about evolution. We are going to start our class off tomorrow with a discussion. So it really needs to be what you're bringing to the table. All right, thanks, guys. Good night.